Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. We're all about the places where design and development overlap. We talk with the industry experts about trends in design, development, and take a look at new ways to build digital experiences, typically over a beer or two. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud or at knapsackcloud. We are still under COVID lockdown, and today I am talking with one of the only people who still has a haircut during this time, Jason Lengstorf. He's host of the podcast Learn with Jason. He does developer experience at Netlify. Jason, thanks for coming. Really great to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We kind of hit it off on Twitter and I think sitting next to each other at a restaurant at one point and just ended up chatting about design and development and what you do and sort of the work you've done. And then I saw recently your episode with Dan Mall, and I got excited because you guys were talking all about design systems and how you get design systems to really implement change at organizations. And I wanted to have a similar conversation with you. So tell us a little bit about what this topic means to you, this whole idea of adopting a design system inside of an organization.
So I've worked, my career started with kind of freelance, and then I kind of turned that into agency work. And then I went to the opposite end of the spectrum and worked at IBM. And now I've kind of settled back into startup land. And at every stage that I've been at, what I've noticed is that the challenges were almost never, can we build this thing? It was almost always, can we build this thing and get somebody else to use it? Mm-hmm. And so I think that, like, for me personally, this is a big topic, because I think that my ability or inability to accomplish that, the driving of adoption and the fostering of alignment around whatever approach we choose, that's been the make or break for me at every stage. Like, my agency failed because I was bad at that. I didn't drive adoption with my team. When I was at IBM, we led some successful adoptions of new tools, and that led to me getting the ability to get the roles that I have now. Right? It's kind of an unsung hero of where you go beyond like the individual contributor level. If you want to impact systemic change, if you want to impact organizational direction, this is such a critical thing to understand and to like pay attention to.
Right. And I think it's honestly kind of what separates a lot of people from being individual contributors to being people that get at the seat of the table for design or make that big organizational shift. It's a really kind of vulnerable statement about the reason why your agency failed was you weren't good at the adoption side of things. Tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what was it that you were missing? What was the missing ingredient?
Like, the short version of that story is that, I started out as a freelancer, and as I got busier, I started to hire subcontractors, and then I turned some of those subcontractors into full-time employees. And I eventually got so stressed out that I sold the agency to some of the stakeholders in the company and just kind of walked away. I had no idea what I was going to do next. I was just like, I can't do this. And what I'd found was that there's a thing that happens when you are good at school where everybody tells you that you're really smart. Mm-hmm. And you start to get it into your head that you can solve any problem. And I think that's a really good thing, because it taught me to believe that I was capable of solving problems. But it also taught me that I could work hard enough to get through any problem instead of necessarily thinking about how else I could solve that problem. I try to go through instead of around. Mm-hmm. And what that led to, especially in my agency, was this thing where I would have an idea and it would work for me. And then I would try to roll it out to my team, and they either wouldn't get it or they wouldn't like it or some combination thereof. But rather than me thinking about, well, what happened there? What went wrong? I would either force it and, drive them to, quit, or drive them to just basically beat all the creativity out of them by forcing them to do the thing that I had done. Or I would decide that it must have been that the idea wasn't right. So I would throw out all of my work and start from scratch and build a whole new thing. And so I was burning so many cycles, and I was driving down the morale of the team. And ultimately what it came down to is I wasn't asking the question, why don't people want to use this? Why is this falling flat? And if I had asked those questions, I would have realized that the problems weren't necessarily the technology. The problems weren't the choices that were made. The problems were context, were understanding, were a feeling of ownership and autonomy over what things were happening, as opposed to me just kind of acting like a dictator up at the top, saying well, this is my decree and you must do things as I say. And I feel like that was that was like my first really hard business lesson, because that agency stressed me out so hard that toward the end this wasn't medically confirmed, but I'm fairly certain based on my WebMD research that I had stress-induced alopecia.
Oh, wow.
Just like huge chunks of my beard fell out. I couldn't grow a beard for a couple years. It was like, all right, I just have like big bald spots on my chin. And so I was forced to wear a mustache for a couple years, which is like, you want to talk about getting humbled. Be a round-faced guy who is real pasty and force him to wear a mustache for 2 years. And that is, it's not great. I learned a lot about myself.
Well, at least you have a nice full beard now. That hopefully means that like change has been positive in your life from those times.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the good thing, if you want to take a silver lining out of something like that, the upside of basically being forced to re-examine your entire life. Like, you've built this whole career, built this whole identity around me thinking I was this, you know, like visionary leader of an agency and all this, you know, I like cocky 20-year-old stuff, and having all of that just burnt to the ground, like realizing like, no, you couldn't handle this. You actually screwed this up pretty badly. And like, you had to walk away. You couldn't save it. You had to like exit. That caused me to start asking the questions that I should have been asking all along. Why didn't it work? What was I doing that I could have done differently? How could I have presented the information differently? How could I have packaged this? How could I have understood what people were going through and like why they were pushing back, as opposed to just thinking that if I kept trying new combinations, that everybody would just magically click and do the thing that I wanted.
Yeah, you're sort of tickling the organizational behavior side of my brain. I spent a lot of time on that in my MBA, and like one of the interesting parts about what you're saying is this notion of intention, and how that intention can oftentimes be either matched with similar intentions or find resistance. And I mean, there's a lot of meta levels to this, right? Like there's the intention in your life of like, hey, you know, this got to the point where you actually had to move away from it. And it's always that feeling of like, are you moving away from something or are you moving towards something else? And one of those things has a different kind of intention than the other. And likewise, having this idea of, I have this agency where I have these people that I'm intending to have them act or behave a certain way, but I'm facing resistance, or I'm getting buy-in, and the sort of resistance that comes along with that. You're thinking about that relative to your personal life first. You know, what was it like to leave all that behind? I mean, I can imagine this is, you know, your identity, your life, your career, all sort of wrapped up in this. That's got to be at least humbling, if not shattering, to jump into an entirely different thing. Like, what was your process for figuring out what was going to happen next?
I don't know that I would say I handled it well. I basically I booked a trip to Alaska where I wouldn't have cell phone service, and just like stayed in the woods for a couple of weeks, and did like I went out, did all the things that I told myself I never had time to do. Like I went out and laid crab traps in the morning, and then we would go pull them up and, you know, kill and cook the crabs. And I was like, you know, fulfilling this fantasy of being completely self-sufficient, right? Which even in that stint, I wasn't.
Very thorough of you.
Right, yeah. But I was like, I need to get completely away from this. I need to create some distance between me and this problem. And that was as I was in the process of walking away. And then once I did walk away, I canceled the lease on my apartment. I booked a one-way ticket to Europe, and I spent 2 years living out of Airbnbs, just kind of like I had one really great contract with a company that I had a good relationship with, where they wanted me to do not quite full time, and they paid me well, but I was living in Thailand, so I didn't need like lots of income. So I bounced around between like cheaper European countries, Asian countries, and places where I could just kind of like have the distance from myself, my career, to think. So I just read a bunch of books, and I was with my partner. And so she and I were just kind of like off gallivanting around the world. And what I found was that it launched me into like a brutal quarter life crisis kind of. I think I was in my almost 30, and I just like had this thought in my head, you know, as someone who in their 20s had believed that you had to have things figured out by the end of your 20s or like your life was over. Seeing 30 approaching as I was admitting to myself that I'd completely blown it as like running this agency. It's kind of like, great, I have literally failed. Like I have done all of the things wrong and I'm back at square one and I'm about to turn 30. Like this is everything that I was afraid of.
Hey, hang on just a second. I'm sorry. This is like a low flying aircraft or something like that. And like, this is so good. I love it. This is awesome. It's just like literally like birds and an aircraft all at one time. So you were talking and you were saying, you know, that he literally had failed and go from there. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like that was too good to have bad audio for it.
No worries. Yeah. So I was kind of like off in an Airbnb in Thailand and just facing this reality that like I had a belief about myself, which was that in order to be successful, I needed to have everything figured out by 30. Mm-hmm. And I was staring down 30 and I had just walked away from everything that I'd been working on building. And I was like, great. What, like, does anything that I do matter? Do I have any meaning? What's my value as a person? What am I actually contributing? Because I just had to come to terms with the fact that like all of this stuff I'd been building with my agency wasn't me. Like I had to extract my identity from my career. And that left a weird gap. Like that vacuum was rough because I felt like there was stuff I wanted to do, but I knew that I couldn't do the unhealthy pour my whole life into my career thing. And so I had to kind of think about what I wanted to do next. And that actually informed my decision to go to IBM because I wanted to go to a company where my job was my job. Mm-hmm. And I knew that in order to do that, it had to be a company that I couldn't feel like ownership over. I knew that if I went to a small startup, I would start to feel like, oh, the success or failure of this company hinges on me.
Right.
But if I go to IBM, it's like, I mean, I can drive success for IBM, but like I can't make or break IBM. It has to be the whole team. And so that was kind of like, okay, this takes the pressure off me. It's no longer like I can't go in here and believe that I'm a solo act that's going to hero my way through whatever business goal. Like I'm going to have to work with the team. I'm going to have to admit that I don't actually matter all that much in the grand scope of business. And I'm going to have to find a way to derive meaning in my life outside of my job.
So you go kind of from this idea of you're the person that everybody relies on. And I identify with that a tremendous amount because most of my life has been small startups or early stage organizations that, you know, everybody's stroke in that boat matters. And you kind of take on this deep sense of responsibility for the success or failure of that business. Mm-hmm. And so for you had this moment where you could kind of like say like, all right, I need a really big reset. I'm going to go, you know, out to the Alaskan wilderness and spend some time there. But moreover, I'm going to kind of redefine what work means for me in the context of my own life and my own identity. Mm-hmm. And that shift in identity then led you to a place where you got to do some pretty incredible things.
Yeah. I wouldn't trade my quarter life crisis for the world. Like being able to spend the time out in the, like I developed such a good sense of empathy out in the world. Like I feel like it's where I aged out of all of my silly kid stuff, like believing that the world was a meritocracy. Totally, being out in the world totally cured me of that. Like seeing how hard people work and get nowhere. I don't work anywhere near that hard. And I didn't even have to try to get further. Yeah,
that's one of the great myths that I think that we're all sold growing up, especially in the United States. But I think we're not alone in that. You know, hard work is, if you just worked harder, you'd be a billionaire, right? Like, I don't think that that's necessarily true. And I had a very similar experience. The more I traveled, the more I saw how fundamentally challenging the roadblocks were in front of people that worked way harder than me. That was very eye-opening for me as well. Yeah,
and it's funny because like there's a duality to all these statements, right? Because like, yes, working hard makes a difference, but you're making a difference on a spectrum. Like if we look at my life as being part of a spectrum, my hard work will make a difference between maybe like, you know, let's say I'm at like the 90th percentile of privilege in the world, which I think is largely true. My hard work will make a difference between me going from like 90 to 95 or 90 to 85. Mm-hmm. But I'm still, no matter what I do, I'm going to be in great shape just by existing, right? I drew the winning ticket when I was born of being in a middle-class family in America, being a white dude. Like I just have lots of things that worked out for me. I can work hard and make my situation better. I can work hard and hopefully use that to make other people's situation better. or I can do nothing and I'll like drift to a point where I could be like mad about all the things I'm not getting. But you know, it was good for me to be out and see that, because it helped me to realize that like my experience is not canon. What I experienced as a kid growing up in Montana and what I experienced when I moved out of Montana into Portland, Oregon, that was a very, very limited worldview. And I think if I'd never left, I might still believe some of that stuff. Like, oh, well, you know, if you're feeling like you don't get far enough, maybe you should work harder. It's like, I don't believe that anymore. Like,
yeah, no, I totally understand what you mean. I think that there's a worldliness that comes with travel, and it sounds like through your core life and through this journey that you've been on, it's kind of helped shape you to be a more well-rounded person, or at least a more mindful one of what's going on around you. Like thinking back to the accomplishment side of things, like I think that, you know, you owning an agency and you being a part of that thing in your life, and now seeing where you're at with, you know, this podcast, with working at crazy fast growing startup like Netlify, seeing some of the work you did with IBM, I think that it would be fair to say that, you know, you probably ended up on the right side of that, where, you know, now if you had an agency, I'm not sure you'd be as happy or feel as successful as where you're at now in your life.
Well, and I think that's the thing that's interesting, right? Is I actually think I could, because of what, like all the things that I've learned. Like I if I had an agency today, it would be a very different experience from what it was when I had it when I was, you know, 25. But that's the part that's, I think, maybe my biggest win from all of this, is through having these experiences, what I realize is it's not the format that matters, it's the approach. Because you can make, you know, I could be a cog in a machine at somewhere like IBM, and I feel like I could be happy there. I probably, like, there are places that I'm more suited for, but, you know, I did the startup life, and it was, you know, it's got a lot of ups, it's got a lot of downs, and I did the enterprise life, it's got ups and downs, did the solo life, ups and downs. And all of that cured me of this idea that there is like a perfect job. Like, no matter what I do, there's going to be stuff that I like and stuff that I don't. And so the challenge here isn't looking for the thing that removes all the pain. It's looking for the thing that provides enough rewards that it's worth sticking through. And I think that can exist at any organizational style or at any scale.
No, I think that's a good metaphor for kind of some of the earlier stuff we were talking about too, where, you know, getting people to change behavior in an organization. It's not about necessarily like solving everything at once. Like you see, back to design systems for a second, like you think about design systems as like, hey, this is going to charge all of these different teams with solving all the problems we've ever had as an organization. And they're not really about solving work, right? There's still work, there's still pain associated with that work, but it's about making it so that there's an end to that feels worth it, that feels like you're in this new place where the constraints and variables are different, and you like those, you like that new reality more than you like the old one.
Yeah. So I had, I did this project when I was at IBM where we took a bunch of messy stuff. Like IBM, I was on the IBM cloud team, and they were migrating from like this big Java monolith. It was, what was it? It was like Java and Dojo and a bunch of jQuery stuff in it. And it's kind of like big million line monolithic app. And then they had started the move to microservices, but they did what a lot of big companies do, which is they say, okay, so the way that we're going to do microservices is we're going to spin up 35 parallel instances of the monolith. And then each team can start to tear down like the pieces that they don't need anymore. And eventually we'll have these like, you know, these well-suited microservices. As you can imagine, that had varying degrees of success depending on the team. And then we started to have these issues where the front ends were built in a way that was kind of like you had your front end and then you had the back of the front because the front end was a node microservice.
Right.
And that would start to implement these weird proxies and caching layers. And then you had the actual back of the back where you had your Java monolith. And the challenge that we ran into with that is like nobody knew what the hell was going on. You couldn't fix things. My team started working on something that was like an actual abstraction of the front end away. We started moving toward Jamstack stuff, which is really like how I started falling down this rabbit hole in the first place. So we started to build a GraphQL layer, which was just a thin client that removed the need for the proxies because GraphQL lets you kind of build a bespoke query instead of needing to write proxies to create your own bespoke queries. And when we did that, we were able to move the front ends completely away, and we had no buy-in. Like nobody was interested in this. And we had demonstrated it. Like We took
Right. Why are you rewriting all your service layers?
that was it, right? So our team took this. We did this. We did a proof of concept, and in a matter of weeks, we rebuilt a whole section of the UI that had been under construction for months, like potentially over a year. They'd been trying to rebuild this thing, and we made it like literally 300 times faster than it was before. We cut down all of these blocking calls. We eliminated all this junk. It was so much smaller, so much faster. And we went and presented it. And we were like, hey, do you want to use this? And everybody was like, no. Like, what? Why? Why don't you want to use this? And I was like in meetings, doing presentations, showing off these numbers, talking about how exciting it was that we could introduce these new things that would eliminate problems. And there was zero buy-in. Like everybody was just like, no, we're not going to do that. Like the way we've got is fine. And I got pulled aside by a senior VP. He was my skip level manager, a guy named Nick Sarial. And he just started telling me a story about how he had done the exact same thing in his previous company. He's like, yeah, we built this thing, made everything better, and nobody would use it, and we couldn't figure out why. And the story he told me was about the diagram that they drew when they were trying to share it with other teams. In their presentation, they would show the other team's service as this box on the screen, and then they would show their service as a box on the screen. And then they had like the before slide, which was the box on the screen, and then another box that listed off all of the things that had to happen that they were managing. And he's like, yeah, just nobody got it, right? Nobody understood what was happening. And then I had this idea.
Right, connecting the dots is hard.
Yeah. So then he had this idea, and he redrew his diagram, and he made their service teeny tiny. It was like, so here's your app, here's what you were doing before, and here's our teeny tiny little service. And he made zero changes to it other than the visual of drawing the box smaller. And it started to get people to try it. And that led him to an epiphany, and something that I've kind of carried with me since is like, when you're working with an organization, our instinct, especially if you're a passionate person who's like driven by building new stuff and trying new things, our excitement is like, oh, this is new, this is exciting, it's powerful, think of all the things we could do. That is the worst thing that you can hear if you are maintaining enterprise systems. The last thing you want is some young hotshot coming in saying, I've got this new thing, it's going to change everything, I'm going to rip your whole system up, and you get to maintain it forever.
Right. I know. It's like, let me break the status quo, introduce a bunch of risk into the process that has been de-risked now for potentially years. And let's all get on board with that.
Yeah. And so I literally then changed my tack, and the way that we would talk about this adoption, the way that my team wrote presentations, was we made it as boring as possible. So what we started doing instead was we would list all the pain points of using the old system. And then we would just say, this is the security concern you don't have to worry about. This is the code you don't need to maintain anymore. This is the thing you don't need to do anymore. And all you have to do is this tiny little box. And that got our first couple teams to adopt it, our first couple teams to be willing to try it. And as soon as a couple teams saw the benefits, then there was consensus. Like the social proof was there, where like, it wasn't just me saying, hey, look, I'm a hotshot with an idea. And it wasn't my team waving our arms and saying, look how great we did. It was now like multiple teams were seeing reproducible results, and they were enjoying it. They understood it. They felt like their lives were actually easier. And that was when we started to see the dominoes start to fall. And, it's still like, it's years later, and I still don't think that they've migrated everything over to a new system. Like, it's a big system. It's a big team. Things happen very, very slowly, but the momentum is there. Like, as teams take on these new projects, they're actually willing to adopt the new workflow. That was a huge moment for me, because I'd never navigated large organizations like that.
No, that's interesting. The idea of navigation of something like that at that scale. I mean, we spend a lot of time with enterprise customers, and we typically talk about, crawl, walk, run, and all those other like concepts that are sort of rote to adoption. But one of the things that I always try to tell people is, don't look at a design system that has had 5 years in the tank and say, that's what we're going to be next year.
Right.
Like, don't do that, because you're setting yourself up for failure. Set yourself up for like, we're going to accomplish one big thing, and that thing is going to be really, really simple. Like, take the simplest, most effective, most impactful thing that you can grab and say, this is what we're going to try in the next year. And that is usually enough to get people to start to realize the value of these systems, and to frankly build some champions of your own, right? Like you said, if you're that passionate, creative, excited person that is super stoked about implementing a design system, it takes a little bit of time to build that stoke with other people.
Yeah.
And you can get there pretty quickly if you bite off a manageable piece and roadmap it and make it predictable. And like you said, make it really simple. My favorite diagrams that I show our customers are tool chain diagrams where you have 60 different tools that they're using to stand up a design system. And it's like, Atlassian over here and Figma and Sketch over here and all these other things, all of these other places. And then you say like, okay, so this is the way that you guys build software today. If we were to say that we have a design system, like here's the piece of this that we get to cut out and we replace it with one box. And I think that that's a really powerful message to people where you basically say like, this isn't about introducing an entire new way of doing things. Again, it's not about fixing work, but it's about introducing a simple concept that can make a really big change across the organization.
Yeah. Something that I've really noticed for me is that a lot of times when you think about this stuff empathetically, what's really exciting for me is not exciting for a team. And so I might be really stoked about the tools. I might be really stoked about how clever the implementation is, but that doesn't really affect the people who use it. So I try to think about it more as like a kitchen appliance, right? Or like a shovel or whatever. Like what I'm building might be a huge improvement over what existed before, but if it looks hard to use, they're not going to use it. So I think about it as like a kitchen appliance. Like what's going to cause somebody to switch from like using a hand mixer to buying a stand mixer? I don't know, but you need to solve that problem. Like you start to look at like, oh, well, for me, the engineering is brilliant. We've got this like, this really strong gear, everything that we're doing in the stand mixer it's going to be able to handle bigger loads and it can do things so fast. And I love the precision engineering of all the gears inside. That doesn't matter. What I care about is that my arm doesn't get tired when I make dough.
Right.
And so when I'm thinking about,
or it matches my kitchen.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So now when I'm building systems, I think about like, I talk to my team about how excited I am about like how clever it is. I'll write a think piece or I'll like rave about it on Twitter, how excited I am that I was able to use this thing that was cool. But when I actually go to teach somebody how to use it, what I'm going to talk to them about is how they're no longer going to have sore arms, right? Like this is going to take some pain away for you. This is going to remove some tedious task that you've had to do every time that you don't want to do in the first place. It's just going to automate that away so that your life gets easier. And if you frame it that way, if you're thinking about it kind of empathetically, the person you're marketing to, like when you have a design system for a team, you're not trying to get them stoked about how beautiful the design system is. You're trying to get them to stop building their own design system, right? You're trying to unify. You're trying to get them to stop doing work. I want you to use this box instead of building your own box. And so in order to do that, we have to make it less painful. We have to remove that pain so that it's easier. I kind of hammer on this point all the time, but I just talk about making the right thing the easy thing. You want to smooth the path so that whatever it is that you want people to do is the default option. Like if they choose the laziest option, they should do the thing that you want. And that's on you as a designer or as a product builder to make sure that you've thought through how people are going to use things and what all the weird edge cases and catches are to make sure that your thing is the easiest, most ergonomic, most default thing that somebody could do. If that, to me, that's a sign of a well-designed product.
Yeah, it's funny. I always think about the snowball analogy there, and not in the snowball analogy of like the thing getting bigger and bigger, right? But if you're thinking about a snowball falling down a hill, it takes the shortest path to the ground, the shortest path to the lowest point, unless it builds up enough momentum,
right? And
that path turns, and then it's able to jump a path or move to a different line. And I always think about that as you're not trying to necessarily build the snowball. You're trying to get the momentum headed in the right direction to go where you want to go. Maybe that's breaking the analogy a little bit too far, but anyway, it's always worked for me to kind of describe how these things go. And I think this is one of the challenging parts that we're all facing in just enterprise organizations these days. Is a lot of these broader systematic ideas of change, things like design ops and design thinking and broad adoption of new design practices and new software development practices is that these are things that are inherently driven by teams, not by individuals. So it doesn't matter how excited one person is on that team. It's about getting the whole team to use that thing and to get bought into it. So, your piece of software that you as an individual pick up for $30 a month doesn't have a lot of impact if you can't get the other, 40 to 400 people on your team to actually adopt and use it. And I think that that's actually a serious challenge that's facing enterprise right now. Is a lot of those individual contributor changes have happened. And it's not to say there aren't more of them. There are always more. But a lot of the waves of change that we're seeing now are these more systematic, more team-oriented shifts in behavior, shifts in ways that we're thinking about doing business and building stuff.
Yeah. I think, and I really like that analogy too of like as something gains momentum, it doesn't necessarily need to follow the path of least resistance anymore. It can kind of plow through. And that's interesting on two levels, because that's very much like a double-edged kind of thing, because if you've got a system that's got adoption, that inertia, or I guess the existing momentum, makes it really hard for people to take on something that might actually be less work. And that's, that again, if I kind of shoehorn this back into what I was initially trying to say, is like, that's what you're combating when you go into this room is you're taking somebody who knows the system. They're super familiar. They're super comfortable. They can make, it might not be what they want to do, but they know they can make it do what they need to do. And then you're showing them something new and say, well, just change the way you do stuff.
Did you just describe every React developer ever?
I mean, I think it's every developer ever, right? Like, we all get into our patterns where we've got the tools that we like and we want to use our tools because those are the tools we know. And because the opposite of that is this thrash where like you spend so much time learning new tools that you never get anything done. So
people have a shitload to learn right now anyway, right? Like, if you think about like what a front-end engineer needs to know today versus yesterday versus tomorrow, like the pace of change is rapid and only getting faster. So you can understand the aversion to, let me go retool everything, or let me go learn this entirely different way of doing something.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of that, and I understand the hesitance to shift, and I understand and I also understand like the excitement when something new comes out, right? Like we all just saw whatever, like Recoil got launched, and it's like, oh, here's this really cool thing that's for a very niche use case, and there was a little bit of a rush to like use it, and I remember I watched the presentation, I was like, this is really cool. I don't need this. And I just, I haven't used it, and I probably won't for a while, but now I know, it's like in the back of my head, like someday I might hit a use case where this makes sense, at which point I will go back and learn this tool. But until that point, it's just maybe like my survival instincts as a developer, as I've gotten older and learn more and more, is like, I can't learn stuff just in case anymore. I have to approach learning as a just in time kind of thing. Like, I have a use case and I need to solve it. What can I learn that will help me solve this? As opposed to, I need to know all the things just in case I run into them.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've told the joke before on this podcast about how, two front end developers go into bar and they have nothing to talk about. Basically looking at like the front end of the front end, the back end of the front end, and how, you can basically say like, I have, somebody that knows JavaScript, and you're like, well, which JavaScript, right? And that diversity that has sprung up around this is based on this need, I think, of individuals to go really deep into a discipline instead of being really wide. I mean, the most successful developers I know are really, really good at a particular use case in development, not necessarily good at all kinds of development. And that's not to say they can't go learn other things, right? That's a part of the job. But, I'm not going to go hire somebody to write my Node app that is really, really good at, Kubernetes or even something like React, right? Like, I want somebody that has that understanding of the way that system interacts with all its different moving parts. Now, I would take somebody that had done something similar and say, like, please go, deep into this and learn about it. But basically saying that we should all be good at everything is a recipe for not having anybody really world class at anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's a term that I learned from a friend of mine, Robin Cannon, who he described people as being like paint drip developers. So it's not full stack. It's not like there's the other concept of like being T-shaped, where you have a broad understanding that's shallow, and then you have a deep understanding in one area. And I think that is like, I do know people who are like T-shaped, and I think that having a depth of knowledge is amazing. Being like an expert on a thing that can be your whole career, depending on what it is that you specialize in. But this idea of like paint drip developers is that you're probably going to be shallow in a lot of places, and then you have varying levels of depth depending on what you've worked on. So for example, like I've spent a lot of my career building front ends. So I have a lot of like front end performance knowledge. I have a lot of generalized JavaScript knowledge, like, what's supported on different platforms. And that ends up being a big benefit to me, because now I can kind of walk into different front end frameworks and I understand the general concepts that they're built on. But I ended up going way deeper in React than I have on anything else. But each of those things, am I a leading expert on front end performance? No. Am I a leading expert on React? No. But I know enough about them that I can get things done. And where I think what I like about the paint drip, aside from the fact that it, suits my resume, is what I also like about it is that it creates the opportunity for cross-pollination. And, one of the things that I think is most fascinating about development and technology in general is that because technology touches all parts of our lives, even when you're doing something like what you could call just regular old web development, the overlap of your different skill sets, what you were before you were a web developer, what you're into outside of work, all of these things create this cross-pollination where you have a unique experience and you can draw connections between different things in your life and your professional experience and your, throughout your career that lead to unique outcomes and to things that I think are really, really cool. And you see that with the specialization that different people have, where, like Charity Majors goes and creates Honeycomb, which is this fascinating instrumentation tool built on all of her overlapping skill sets in like all the different stuff she's done and the things that she's observed in organizations and all that. That's like connecting dots of experience, of expertise, of all that. And you see somebody like the Tailwind CSS crew, like that business.
Tailwind's awesome.
I can't believe how successful that is. But it's just an overlapping, like, they saw a need with Tailwind. They saw a gap in team collaboration. They saw a need for like ready-made components, and they connected all those dots. And then they used their other experience in like marketing and selling and putting things out there. And that turns into this amazingly successful business. I'm consistently blown away by that level of like dots connecting and people seeing opportunities, to build truly unique things. And I think that paint drip is important there, where you've got that breadth of experience with like varying levels of depth in different places.
No, I tend to be really mindfulness nerdy as well. And I love the idea of the interconnectedness of it, despite paint drip being obviously a self-serving analogy. I think that, it makes sense, right? When you think about, the depth is the sum of people's experiences.
Right.
It's not any one thing that really matters. It's the interconnectedness of those things. And I completely agree with that. I think that what I do see a lot, and I guess like the response to that piece of it is when you see somebody that has like a finger in every pie and is just trying to fundamentally do too much to understand the full range of the technology ecosystem, right? We build a lot of systems now that are these really broad reaching technology ecosystems that are pretty impossible to totally deconstruct and understand. And the people that spend their lives doing that, I think that they're maybe not better for it. It would be maybe better to say, like, let me look at those interconnected pieces and try to tackle a realm that I do understand and go deep into that realm, be that JavaScript, be that backend systems, whatever. But don't try to basically say like, I'm going to understand all of tech.
Yeah, I think the thing that's important in any statement about, I think just as a general truism, is like this all happens on a spectrum. If someone is a deep expert on one thing to the point that they have no experience outside of it, it's not very useful expertise. If somebody has, the equivalent of I read the encyclopedia and memorized words, like, yeah, the names of lots of things and you don't know how to use or connect any of them. So the goal is to find a spot on that spectrum where like maybe it does make sense for you to go super deep and become like a leading expert on one component in a system in your team, because that makes you highly valuable. It gives you an unbelievable amount of expertise and knowledge, and that becomes super marketable. Like you see that now with during quarantine with people going into COBOL. Like the people who built deep expertise in COBOL, like turns out there's this very small niche market for deep experts in COBOL because there's a lot of legacy systems built on it that need maintenance.
No, I remember touching COBOL briefly in my CS, background back in college, and just being like, well, this is going to be going away in 10 years. So what does it matter? And like, lo and behold, every single state unemployment system still runs on it.
Right. And so it turns into this thing that like, but there's a limit on that, because if everybody goes and becomes an expert on COBOL, the value of that skill disappears. So there's a risk of going deep, which is that like when you choose a niche, if you choose a niche that is saturated, then you're competing with a lot of experts for a limited number of jobs. Going broad, you have the opposite problem, which is that there are tons and tons and tons of people who are generalists. And so now you're competing for difficult to define jobs. But it also means that you're maybe a little more capable of stepping in and learning a thing. So what I've found and what's worked for me is to be curious about everything, but don't learn a thing until it's time to learn it. Like if I go on the job and the job uses React, like that's why I learned React. I took a job that a UI was built in React, so I learned React. And then that made it easier for me to get more jobs with React. So I went deeper and deeper there.
So you took a job as a front end web developer.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, but like I'm
just kidding. It's a joke about everybody using React nowadays.
Yeah. But it's true. Like that's how I learned Angular too. I can't remember which version it was. It was either Angular 1 or Angular 2. But I got a freelance contract that was using Angular, and so I learned it. And, toward the end of that project, I kind of knew enough about what I liked to know that I didn't want to do a lot of Angular work. And that's not like to trash Angular. I think it's really well constructed, but the boilerplate of it was not my style. But I think that's the only way you can learn like where you want to go in your career is by trying stuff out. And I think if you never go deep enough to actually experience a thing, you just go deep enough to like learn the hello world style kind of like, hey, I'm going to dip my fingers into this and see what it feels like. You can get a taste, but until you've actually built a thing with it, you go a little bit deeper. You can't really understand if it's something that you do or don't like. Because first impressions are only first impressions. It's like the honeymoon period, or like the judging a book by its cover, depending on how you want to phrase this, where it's like, I might look at something and go, no, I don't want to do that. And then turns out later, it was just unfamiliar to me, but I actually love that. It's the way that I want to do everything. Or vice versa, where like I see something and go, this is amazing. And I go recommend it to everybody. And then I actually use it for a month and I'm like, this has so many downsides when you get deeper into it.
I love that you can both be the evangelist and the skeptic. I think that's an awesome trait. By the way, this has been an awesome convo. It's been great to chat with you.
Yeah, of course.
It's good to get to know you a little bit too. Like, it's neat stuff.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Jason, thanks so much for all the time you took today, sharing such a personal story. It's awesome to get to hear about your journey, about your thoughts on how you go about adopting these big, broad systems, and even about just work in general. So just want to say thanks. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter @TheDSPod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.